It was 1942. Madam Chiang Kai-shek went to America. Her address to the US Congress was a huge hit. "God damn it," one congressman said, "Madam Chiang had me on the verge of bursting into tears."
We in China, like you, want a better world. Not for ourselves alone, but for all mankind. And we must have it.
Allied airmen risked their lives to supply Chiang Kai-shek across the Himalayas. Allied officers trained Chinese men. It was glamorous and expensive. By the time the Allies sat down together in Cairo in December 1943, the cracks were showing. Churchill thought the China campaign was a waste of money and men. Madam didn't like the interpreter. She reinterpreted everything said to or by her husband. President Roosevelt was worried about China's lack of democracy, and his top general nicknamed Chiang the Peanut. In Yan'an, the communists hoped to benefit from this American disillusion. Mao now controlled an area of 54 million people. He needed modern weapons to defend them. In July 1944, he and Zhu De greeted their first official visitors from America. The Dixie Mission. The American officers saw a well-fed and self-confident communist army. They were impressed. Treated to some Yan'an-style culture, the American newspaper reporters liked what they saw too. The New York Times ran a headline, "Yan'an, a Chinese wonderland city." By the time the Americans left Yan'an, most were convinced the communists were better partners than Chiang Kai-shek. Less corrupt, more united, more used to the Allies against Japan. The reopening of the Burma Road early in 1945 was a symbolic step towards victory. Thousands of labourers had worked to repair the vital supply lifeline to the south. And in August, a surprise for war correspondent William Park.
We were just about to fall asleep when we suddenly heard the sound of guns. There were American soldiers everywhere. US Army. They were firing their guns into the air, drinking beer, eating rations out of cans. They were very happy. We asked them what had happened. The Japanese are finished. So the Japanese had surrendered. We had no idea. It wasn't until we saw the Americans celebrating that we found out the Japanese had surrendered.
Japan was defeated, but China was not at peace. US General George C. Marshall's mission: the unification of China by peaceful democratic methods. He did arrange a ceasefire, and he did get an agreement drawn up signed by Jiang Chun for the nationalists and by Zhou Enlai for the communists. All smiles for the camera. But the communists had ended World War II as masters of a huge area of 95 million people. In Yan'an, they were ready to turn 10 years of dress rehearsal into real victory. Undisputed leader of the party was Mao Zedong. He was already a cult figure. A comrade said of him, Chairman Mao is the savior of the Chinese people, the shining light of the workers and peasants, the banner of the broad laboring masses. The Civil War, which now engulfed his country, reached Yan'an in March 1947. As the nationalist bombers flew overhead, shopkeeper Wang Cesar did the same as everyone else living in Newmarket Street.
Newmarket was thriving. So when the nationalists came, we were terrified. Some people took their belongings with them. Others never had the time. Only a minority of people didn't go. Most did. They all fled to the villages, ran into the gullies, hid in the caves. They were scared. I took my wife and children and fled. The goods in the shops were still on display. The nationalists seized everything, took everything away.
In bitter cold, they abandoned Yan'an to the enemy without a shot fired. Chairman Mao and his army took to the hills, returning to the guerrilla tactics they knew so well. Mao told his comrades, "Our policy is to keep the enemy on the run, to tire him out, then look for an opportunity to destroy him." Mao himself went underground with a new alias, Li Deshong. It means determined to be victorious. Yan'an was an empty victory for the nationalists. Their army was overextended, their bureaucracy hopelessly corrupt. Later, Mao wrote this poem. "We were resolute. We were ready to die. We dared command the sun and moon to bring a new day." A revolution is not a dinner party, or writing an essay, or painting a picture, or doing embroidery, Mao wrote. A revolution is an insurrection, an act of violence by which one class overthrows another. Mao cut the cloth of European Marxism into new Chinese shapes. He relied on peasant support. In the weeks after they were chased out of Yan'an by the nationalists, Mao and the Red Army took refuge in the hills to plan the coming battles. In this valley, Zhou Enlai organized a massive meeting attended by peasant militiaman Lei Jiafu.
I don't remember exactly what he said, but the gist of it was, elders of the border region, comrades. Chairman Mao is still in northern Shanxi, and will fight with us and triumph with us. When we heard that Chairman Mao was still here, we all clapped vigorously. The Premier said, "Chairman Mao has already told us the war of liberation will last another 3 years at most, maybe just over 2 years. We must liberate the whole country, advance to Nanjing and capture Chiang Kai-shek." Oh, when we heard that, we were overjoyed and clapped vigorously. They marched past, 4 abreast, foot soldiers, machine gunners, artillery. Oh, when we saw how large Chairman Mao's army was, the older villagers said, "There's hope for the revolution."
The communist counterattack had begun from the far northeast. Their People's Liberation Army were no longer guerrillas, but a powerful conventional force. Half a million men took one Manchurian city after another. The fall of Mukden in September 1948 brought the rich industrial heartland of northeast China into communist hands. The military victories were supported by attractive communist policies. Mao made sure took his best. Most important was land reform. Landlords were dispossessed and their property shared out between poorer peasants. This was wildly popular. Among the beneficiaries,
we would say to the landlords, this is revolution. You've got plenty to eat and drink at home, but a lot of us ordinary folk have nothing. That's why we want to carry out this land reform. We had all sorts of reasons backed up by central government policy. I'd take the document outlining the land reform law and explain it to them. Whether they'd listen or not was another matter.
Trials of crimes against the poor. This was called Speak Bitterness. The oppressed were encouraged to talk openly about their miserable lives. There were terrible excesses. By the end, 1 million may have died at the hands of angry mobs or zealous party officials. The popularity of the land reform swelled the ranks of the Red Army. Peasant sons marched off to war, their lessons in reading, writing, and politics strapped to their backs. Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, said Chairman Mao. Our principle is that the party commands the gun. China tore itself apart. Villages passed from nationalist to communist and back again. In some areas, returning nationalists shot dead 1 member of every household that had taken part in the land reform, or buried alive peasant leaders and their families. Increasingly confident, the Reds flew kites inviting the enemy to surrender. They offered food, shelter, and certain victory. In 4 years, from June 1946, the Communists claimed more than 6 million nationalist soldiers were captured or gave themselves up. All had to be fed and clothed. That challenge was met by a future Chinese leader, Deng Xiaoping. Deng and his comrades had learned a lot in Yan'an. They were skilled in raising help and commitment from country people. Their organization was superb. Tianjin, 80 miles north of Beijing, January 1948. The Communists sent New Year cards into the city. We wish you a long life and a prosperous business. If we should take the city in this new year, do not be alarmed. We shall restore order quickly and welcome your business. Tianjin fell. More prisoners were taken. The nationalists were in full retreat. Mao's troops entered Beijing on January the 31st, 1949. They rode into the old imperial capital on American tanks captured from Chiang Kai-shek's doomed armies. On October the 1st in Tiananmen Square, China's new rulers claimed their victory at the Gate of Heavenly Peace. Run Yuen was there.
Our group from the Ministry of Railways stood there just below those words at the foot of the rostrum. Those words, "Long live the unity of the peoples of the world." I could see every movement, every silhouette on the rostrum very clearly. The atmosphere was unforgettable. It was after Commander-in-Chief Zhu had inspected the troops that Chairman Mao proclaimed, "Today marks the founding of the Central People's Government of the People's Republic of China." At that moment, the whole square was filled with the sound of drums and a sea of flags. We thought then that it hadn't been easy for the Chinese people to stand up. From down below, I looked up at the rostrum and looked in the direction of the memorial. And I thought of when I was on the battlefield, and I remembered my fellow soldiers who'd given their lives. I thought, this victory was made possible by their sacrifice. It hasn't been an easy victory. We must continue their revolutionary testament and dedicate our lives to the building of new China.
Mao set off on his first ever foreign trip to Moscow. It was Joseph Stalin's 70th birthday. The Bolshoi Theatre. At Stalin's right hand stood Mao Zedong, newest symbol of the forward march of world communism. They celebrated Stalin's birthday in China too. While Mao was trying to negotiate economic help from the Soviets, Zhu De was taking delivery of Stalin's presents. But in 10 weeks in Moscow, the Chinese delegation got hardly anything out of Stalin. He didn't like Mao. He called him a margarine Marxist. Long live Comrade Stalin. So the fascination with Soviet culture was short-lived. The Chinese never got the material help from the Russians that they wanted. They had to look for Chinese solutions to Chinese problems. Hold fast to the way of antiquity, say the Taoists, to keep in control the realm of today. For 100 years, reformers had been battling against tradition in China, but the communists were determined to drag their new democracy to the modern age. They started with the women. Women like Su Shuangtian, her feet bound and crippled, to win her a husband to whom she owed total obedience.
They were bound when I was 6 years old. It didn't hurt. My mother bound them. Why did she do it? They look pretty like that. Small feet looked nice. Now they look terrible. But then, nobody wanted you if you had big feet. On our wedding day, he came to fetch me in a sedan chair. We had a sedan chair each, those decorated sedan chairs. I wore a pearl headdress and a robe with dragons embroidered on it. And there was a belt. 2 people supported me as I stepped off the sedan chair. And everyone clapped because I had such small feet. If you had big feet, people wouldn't even bother to look. They'd go away.
How sad it is to be a woman. Nothing on earth is held so cheap. Boys stand leaning at the door, like gods fallen out of heaven. Their hearts brave the 4 oceans, the wind and dust of 1,000 miles. No one is glad when a girl is born. By her, the family sets no store. A 3rd century poet, a 20th century solution. to free Chinese women from the symbolic slavery of the bridal sedan chair. The marriage law of 1950 was one of the party's first acts. It was accompanied by a huge propaganda campaign extolling the virtues of a modern marriage based on freedom of choice and equal rights. Confucius said, "Women are as different from men as earth is from heaven." Mao Zedong said, "Women hold up half the sky." Modern notions imposed on an ancient belief system. The marriage law was not universally popular. Some country people called it the women's law. They said it was an unequal treaty against the men. There was a fierce backlash, but there was no stopping millions of women. Tuo Zhejian was free of her Confucian duty to obey father, husband, and sons.
I tell you about my father. In those days, my father smoked opium. He loved his opium. He smoked until he had no money left, so he had no choice. He gave me away. When the Communist Party came, people said that men and women were free to choose their own partners. If you didn't like the other person, you could choose not to have him. You didn't have to say, "Oh, I couldn't do that." You just followed what the Communist Party said and left. You left. He didn't want me to go, but I didn't like him. So it didn't matter whether or not he let me go. I just got up and went.
"Marriage is nothing but a dream of slavery in another form," declared the young woman who became the first female train driver in China. These images of liberation were driven home. The reforms were accompanied by a stifling ideological uniformity. The plain blue cotton costume worn by men and women was called the Yan'an style of dress. It was a visible effort to maintain revolutionary purity. In New China, opposition was crushed, and not everyone found that attractive.
In Korea, Operation Comeback begins. Away from the barbed wire compounds where they have lived for many months, 22,500 Chinese and North Korean troops take the winding road to freedom.
China had lost almost 1 million men in the 3-year conflict in Korea. In 1954, these thousands of disaffected Chinese prisoners of war were shipped off by their American captors and allowed to join the remnants of Chiang Kai-shek's defeated nationalists in Taiwan.
That's what we were doing.
This was a government impatient for change, men who had already achieved miracles. They'd fought for a lifetime to win the prize of ruling 1/4 of humankind, and yet 4,000 years of history and culture, Mao said, and we can't compare with a country like Belgium. Their problem was the economy. They had a set of ideas about industrialization, borrowed from the Soviet Union at a time when they were still friends with the Russians. But their big steelworks weren't producing enough. What was needed was a great leap forward. Once again, the whole country was mobilized in a fantastic effort. The goal? To catch up with Britain in 15 years, to build a furnace, gather coal, find scrap iron, smelt their own steel.
We had no material to make steel with, no bricks to build furnaces with. In the morning, we rented a bus from the city to bring us here. When we passed Tiananmen, we got everyone to get down and start digging up cobbles from the roadside. Old cobbles. We dug them up and put them on the bus to build our furnace with. We had no iron, so we got everybody to bring their old pots and pans from home. When we started, we were all in high spirits, and we did produce some stuff. But then we conducted tests. We discovered that it was all below standard. It all came apart. So we felt this was a mistake. But then we'd been instructed by the central government, and so we had to follow orders. We had to achieve the impossible, to produce steel on a large scale, to make this our priority.